By 9 o'clock in the morning, the rain coming through the broken mill roof had turned a century of slate dust on the floor into a paste the color of wet ash, and it was still falling in one solid gray sheet. Everything inside that building was wet. The auctioneer had dragged the small lots out to the yard and put them under a tarp, and what was left standing in the middle of the gray water, up on 8 cast-iron legs with the rain running off it, was the one thing at the sale that nobody in the crowd wanted. It was April of 2011, at the Blue Ledge Slate Mill outside Poultney, Vermont. The mill had gone quiet in 1972. The last of the family that owned it had died that winter at 91, and the sale was the ordinary kind. A tractor, 2 flatbed trailers, drills, a compressor, 4 pallets of roofing slate stacked and banded and still perfectly good. 60 years of shop junk laid out on doors set across sawhorses. About 90 people came, and most of them came for the trailers. The machine was Lot 74. The entry in the auctioneer's book read, in full, iron bench saw, large, sold where is, buyer removes. That is an honest description in the same way that calling a locomotive a metal item is honest. What stood on the mill floor was 16 feet of cast iron. A bed like a bridge girder carried on 8 thick legs bolted down to the slab, with 2 machined rails running its whole length and a heavy traveling carriage sitting on them. Over the middle of the bed rose an arch of cast iron 9 feet tall, and across the top of that arch lay a shaft as thick as a man's wrist, turning in 2 bearing caps, with a wide flat belt pulley on one end for a line shaft that had been gone since the mill closed. Under the bed ran a long stone trough. The whole thing weighed 7 tons, had not turned since 1972, and was, on the morning of the sale, 113 years old. It was a saw for stone. You laid a block of slate on the carriage, you wound the carriage in under the blade, and you ran water on the cut, while a 5-foot circular blade came down through the block at about the speed a man's fingernail grows. Every slate mill in that valley had once had 2 or 3 of them working side by side. Then the mills went, and the machines went with them, and by 2011, the one still standing anywhere in Vermont could be counted on one hand. Nobody bid on it, and there were good reasons. The first was the blade, which was missing. The second was the shaft, which took a blade with a bore and a collar that no supplier in the country had listed in 60 years. The third was that the mill's roof had come down at the north end in an ice storm, so the building had to be taken off the machine before the machine could be taken anywhere. The fourth was weight, in a place with no crane, no floor, and 1 narrow lane in. And the fifth was the one everybody kept repeating to each other while they stood around it in the rain, which was that you could not buy a bolt for it. That last part was true, and a scrap buyer out of Rutland named Dale Kessler said it out loud to the whole crowd. Kessler is 51. He buys iron out of 4 counties. He was wearing the mustard-tan jacket he wears in every weather, and he had already done the arithmetic in his head before the auctioneer got to the lot. 7 tons at what iron was bringing that spring delivered was under $1,900. Against that, 3 days of torch work, a rented excavator to pull a building down, a lowboy, and 2 men. He priced the machine at less than nothing, and he was not wrong by a nickel. He said, loud enough for the back of the shed, that the metal in it was worth less than the getting of it out. Then he took a wrench off his belt, laid it on a nut the size of a hen's egg, and turned it a quarter turn so everyone could see it slip. He had 3 wrenches on him. Not one of them sat right. Every fastener on that machine from the through bolts in the bed to the little grub screws in the collars up on the shaft, was cut to a thread that nothing in his truck matched. Hugh Bowen bid $50. There is a particular noise a country auction makes when a man bids on something nobody wants, and it is not quite laughter and not quite applause. Somebody at the back said he had just bought the most expensive place to sit down in Vermont. Kessler turned around, saw who it was, and said, without any meanness in it, that Hughie had bought himself a roof to take off and 7 tons he could not move. The auctioneer said sold, wrote the number down, and moved on to a pallet of drill steel. The whole thing took 40 seconds. If you've made it this far into Hugh's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Hugh Bowen was 63 years old and had been putting slate on other people's roofs for 40 of them. He is not a collector. He does not restore machinery, and he had never owned a machine tool in his life. He owns a flatbed, a shed, staging, and about 900 pounds of hand tools, and his qualification for what followed is embarrassingly small. He can tell you the size and the thickness of a roofing slate by the way it sits in his hand, because he has handled something like 2 million of them, and because he came from people who did the same. His great-grandfather came off a boat in 1881 out of Bethesda, in Caernarfon, in the north of Wales, and walked into the Vermont Slate Valley with a splitting hammer, since that valley was opened by Welshmen, and half the stones in the chapel yard still carry Welsh names. He had walked around Lot 74 twice at the preview the day before. On the second pass he crouched at the end of the bed and rubbed at the black grease and slate dust crust with his thumb, and under the crust was the edge of something raised in the iron. Letters, cast in, not stamped. He could not read them, and he did not try very hard, but he had spent his whole working life on old roofs, where you learn to tell at a glance a thing that was made somewhere else from a thing that was made here. And he had a feeling, which is all it was, that those letters were not going to say Vermont. There was one other moment at that sale worth keeping. An old woman named Verna Tatro, 88 years old, whose grandfather had run the Blue Ledge Mill, was standing under the tarp out of the rain while her family's shop was sold off around her. When Hugh went to pay, she said the family had always called that machine the Welshman. He asked her why. She said she had no idea. That was just what her grandfather called it, and her father after him, and nobody had ever explained it, and now there was nobody left to ask. It took him 10 weeks to get the machine out, and it cost him $4,100, which is 82 times what he paid for it. The building came down first. Then, with a wire brush and a pry bar and a great deal of penetrating oil, he found that the machine did not have to be cut at all. It came apart into 6 pieces at joints the maker had bolted rather than cast, because a machine like that had to be carried into a mill in pieces before it could ever work in one. The arch lifted off. The bed separated into 2. The legs unbolted. Nothing was torched. At the end of June, it went 4 miles on a borrowed lowboy and came back together on new sills in the equipment shed behind his house. There is a thing that happens when a man does something a whole county has decided is foolish, which is that people drive past slowly. For most of that June, there were pickups pulled onto the shoulder every afternoon while the building came down and the pieces came out on chains, and about half of them stopped to offer some version of the same joke. Dale Kessler came himself on a Tuesday, stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the arch come off, and then offered $600 for the whole of it, loaded, which was more than fair and was meant kindly. Hugh said no. Kessler said, "Suit yourself," and drove off, and told his wife that evening that the roofer had lost the thread of it entirely. Then he cleaned it, and that is where the story turns. Slate dust and machine grease make a paste that goes hard and gray and stays for a century, and it comes off with kerosene and a brass brush in sheets, like old wallpaper. Under it, the iron was not rusted at all. It was painted, and the paint was an oxide red he had never seen on anything else, and it was almost intact. And on the end of the bed, under the patch he had rubbed at in the rain, was a raised cast plate about the size of a paperback book. It read, "Pritchard and Vaughan, Caernarfon, 1898. He sat down on an upturned bucket in his own shed and looked at that for a while. What he did next, he did badly, and it worked anyway. He took 30 photographs on a camera he did not understand. Then he wrote a letter, an actual letter on paper, to a slate museum in the north of Wales, addressed to the curator, whoever that might be, saying that he had a machine in a shed in Vermont with a name on it, and would anybody there like to know. The curator was a woman named Bethan Rowlands, 44, and she telephoned him at 6 in the morning Vermont time, which is 11 o'clock in Wales, 9 days later. Pritchard and Vaughan built slate mill machinery in Caernarfon for 31 years and closed their doors in 1907. In the valleys where their machines had worked, there was not one of them left. The scrap drive of 1941 took the machinery out of 3 closed quarries in a single spring, weighed and gone. Whatever survived that went in the closures between 1969 and 1972, when the mills came down and the men who had worked in them cut up their own machines for weighing money, which is its own kind of sad. Her museum held one hand-cranked jack with that name on it and 2 photographs. The photographs were of a slab saw. The saw in the photographs was gone. She told him, in that first telephone call, what those valleys had been. At the end of the last century, there were something like 17,000 men working slate in the north of Wales, cutting the roofs of a good part of the world out of the sides of mountains, and every mill floor along those valleys carried machines like the one standing in his shed, in rows running off overhead, shafting in the wet and the noise, hour after hour. What is left of all that is a landscape of gray scree, some magnificent empty buildings and almost no machinery whatsoever? She said, in the flat voice of somebody who has said it many times, that her entire professional life had been the study of a thing she had never once seen working. She asked for measurements. He measured. She asked for the pattern letters on the underside of the carriage, and he crawled under with a flashlight and found them. She asked whether the trough still held water, and he filled it with a hose to see, and it did. In March of 2012, she flew to Albany, drove across the mountains, and stood in a Vermont equipment shed with her hand flat on the bed of that machine and said nothing at all for a long time. Then she asked him to wind the carriage. It ran the whole 16 feet on rails cut in 1898 without so much as a catch, and she put her other hand over her mouth. After that, there was talk about money, and money is where it went wrong. A national collection does not simply write a check. There was a heritage fund. The fund required an independent appraisal, and the appraisal was done by a man named Curtis Hallam, 58, who values industrial machinery for insurers and who is very good at it. He came in May with a bright light on a cord, a scraper, and a mechanic's creeper, and he spent most of a day on his back underneath the machine. Late in the afternoon, he came out from under it with grease to the elbows and asked Hugh to come and look. On the underside of the main bed casting, in a place nobody would ever see unless they went looking for it, was a second raised mark, an American foundry's name, out of Troy, New York, with a pattern number beside it. Hallam was not unkind about it. He was simply certain. The slate belt of Vermont and New York, he said, built its own mill machinery for 60 years, and it built it by copying Welsh and English patterns, sometimes down to the last radius. Plates get moved from frame to frame. A Welsh plate on an American bed was a thing he had seen 4 times in his career. His written opinion ran to 2 pages and ended with a sentence that put the machine back exactly where Kessler had put it in the rain. Scrap, minus the getting of it out. The fund paused. Beth and Rowlands wrote him a careful email that took her, he found out much later, most of a day. And Hugh Bowen, who had bid $50 on a machine in a flooded mill with no expectation of money at all, discovered that he minded very much. He is 63 and not a sentimental man, and he told me he sat in that shed with the light off. That was May, and then nothing happened for 5 months. The machine stood on its new sills with a tarp over the shaft and a bucket under one end of the trough, and he went back to putting slate on other people's roofs, which is what he had been doing before any of it started. The county had a version of the story by then, and the version was that the Welsh had said, "No, thank you." Twice that summer, somebody asked him in a friendly way what he was going to do with his $50 mistake, and both times he said he had not decided yet. He had decided. He simply did not have anything to decide it with. Then he did the only thing he has ever been really good at, which is to keep pulling on a thread that does not sit right, because there was still the thing the whole auction had laughed at, and nobody had ever explained. You could not buy a bolt for that machine. Kessler had proved it in front of 90 people with 3 wrenches. If the frame was American, cast in a New York foundry for an American mill in an American valley, then why did every fastener in it fit nothing? He called Arlene Fike, who is 66 and runs a machine shop over in Granville, New York, and who is the only living human being he knows with a complete box of thread gauges. She came on a Saturday with the box and a notebook, and they went over that machine fastener by fastener, and it took them 2 days. They did it properly, because Arlene Fike has never done anything the other way. Every fastener was backed out or cleaned in place, gauged, measured for diameter, and written into the notebook in columns with a note of exactly where on the machine it lived. She still has the notebook. By the middle of the first afternoon, it had stopped being a favor for a neighbor and started being interesting, because a pattern was coming up out of those columns that neither of them had expected, and neither of them said a word about it out loud until the count was finished. There were 71 fasteners on it. 57 of them were cut to pitches that matched nothing in her box. 13 threads to the inch on a 7/8-inch bolt, 11 on a 1-inch, at angles that were nobody's standard and somebody's habit. That is what a small foundry did before standards were standard. It cut its own taps and dies. It kept them in a drawer, and it used them for 31 years, so that every bolt and every machine it ever built came out of the same drawer. It is not a defect, it is a fingerprint, and it was on the inside of that machine as much as the outside, down to the grub screws and the collars up on the shaft, where no forger on earth would ever have bothered. 14 fasteners were different. They were ordinary American coarse thread. They gauged perfectly. Their heads were chamfered another way entirely, and all 14 of them were in one place. They were the bolts holding the bed casting with the Troy foundry mark on it. Arlene Fike put her gauge down on the iron and said the sentence, "The whole thing turns on." That is not the machine. That is a repair. They lifted it. It took a rented gantry and the better part of a day, and when the casting came away, the reason for it was underneath and had been for a century. The original bed had broken clean across a web, the way cast iron breaks when a heavy block comes down on it out of a hoist, and rather than scrap a machine over it, some mill man had carried the broken piece to the nearest foundry and had a new section cast to fit. And the broken end of the original was still there. It was still bolted in at the far end, carrying the same 13 threads to the inch as the rest of the machine and the same pattern letters, because you do not throw away good iron. The foundry in Troy that cast the replacement went out of business in 1911, which means the repair was made in America before 1911, which means the machine was in America and working hard enough to break before 1911, which means it was never built in Troy at all. It was mended there. Curtis Hallam came back at his own expense. He spent a day with the gauges and the notebook and the lifted casting, and then he wrote 3 sentences that reversed his own report and signed them, and I have thought better of him for it ever since. The last piece came from Wales, and it is a small one. In a bound order book from 1899, there is a single line, 1 slab saw per steamer to Fairhaven, Vermont. And in the same firm's later papers, that machine is written off as lost in a mill fire in 1913, a clerk's error 100 years old, which is exactly why nobody in Wales had ever gone looking for it. Their own record said it had burned. It had not burned. It had been sawing slate in a valley in Vermont, and then standing quietly under a hole in a roof for the whole of the century in which they believed it was ashes. There were 2 buyers in the end, and they did not fight each other. The National Collection wanted it for the museum, a working heritage quarry under the mountains run by a man named Ewan Gathin, wanted it turning rather than roped off. They came in together with a heritage grant and a public appeal in the county that raised the last of it in small amounts from about 1,600 people, and in October of 2013, they paid Hugh Bowen $96,000 for a machine he had bought for $50. He had one other offer that year. A dealer in Rutland wanted the bed and the arch for what he called industrial furniture. The bed cut into 3 tabletops, the legs into lamp bases, the arch into something for a hotel lobby. He offered $12,000 in cash that week, and he would handle the hauling. Hugh turned it down in about the time it takes to say no. Before the container came, he drove out to Verna Tatro, who was 88, and who had told him in the rain that her family had always called that machine the Welshman, without ever knowing why. He told her why. She sat with it a moment and said, "Well." Then she said it again. Dale Kessler came to watch it loaded. He had heard the number the way everybody in 4 counties had heard the number, and he stood at the end of the driveway in the mustard jacket, while a crane picked the bed up in slings and set it down on cribbing in a container. When Hugh came over, Kessler put his hand out and said that he had been right about every single pound of it, and that being right about the iron had turned out to be about the least useful thing a man could be. Then he asked whether he could have one of the 14 bolts. He got one. It sits on a shelf in an office in Rutland. It went into that container in Albany and traveled 3,200 miles, which is a shorter distance than it sounds when you consider it took the machine 114 years to make the return trip. It came off a truck in Gwynedd, in a valley of gray scree and stone buildings and rain that would have looked entirely familiar to it, and they re-erected it in a mill shed with a slate floor. A blade was cut for the shaft 5 feet across, the first one made for that collar since the 1930s. In the spring, they put water on it and wound a block of slate in underneath, and it cut at about the speed a man's fingernail grows, exactly as it had in 1898. The first slab it cut went the other way. It was crated and shipped back across, and it is the step in front of the chapel in the Vermont Slate Valley now, where the names on the stones are Welsh, laid by a man in his 60s who put slate on other people's roofs for 40 years and who once bid $50 in the rain because some letters under the grease did not look like they were going to save Vermont. The machine is still there under the mountains, and it still runs on open days, and people who have driven a long way to see it are allowed to wind the carriage, and every bolt in it, except 14, is cut to a thread that fits nothing else on earth.